you recall, most of you will recall the 2008 presidential election and the intense struggle between Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, and then a surprise to some degree that President-elect Obama asked Senator Clinton to be the Secretary of State. It's my understanding that when that selection was made, when she responded affirmatively, she had as a condition that all the key political appointees in the State Department would be those who she selected. There was always a little bit of ambiguity about ambassadorships, and there's actually still a struggle about that. But on the political appointees in state, those were her choices, and unless there was some major issue, the White House approved them, and they had to go get confirmed by the Senate, but then they were approved. Gates was asked to stay on by Obama, Republican, holdover from the Bush administration, Rumsfeld's successor. But Gates primarily had not been active in political life, right? He'd been a career CIA officer. He's the only career officer ever to rise to be director of the CIA. He served in a number of administrations. He was involved with President Carter in the failed Iranian hostage rescue mission. He was involved with President George H.W. Bush when the Berlin Wall fell. He's vast experience over many administrations. So he's never, I think, thought of as a very political person. What I understood, though, was when he was retained, he said, okay, I have one modified condition, nothing at all like Secretary Clinton's condition. My condition is that for the political appointees, and there are only about 30 or 40 of them in the Pentagon, I want to interview each one who's going to be Senate confirmed. I want to have at least a right of first refusal. If there's something about that individual, the background, the approach, whatever, I would at least like to report that to the White House and say I have real reservations about that person. And maybe that person then would be denied the position or not. So actually, when I was informed, I was actively involved in the Obama campaign. Then he was elected. Then I didn't hear anything. I wasn't sure if you never know. It's a real, almost random process, political appointments in Washington. And actually, my wife and I went to Italy on a wonderful vacation after the 2008 election, because I was on leave. I had been dean at Berkeley 10 years, and I was on sabbatical at the time. And when I came back, I was contacted by the transition team at the Pentagon that they wanted to talk to me about a job. Anyway, fast forwarding, I was then told that Secretary Gates wanted to interview me because I was a Senate-confirmed person. And in late January 2009, like a week after Obama became president, I was summoned to Secretary Gates' office in the Pentagon and had a one-on-one interview with him. I'd actually never met him. I've been involved in security issues for many, many years, but our paths set him across. Of course, I knew a lot about him. I knew who he was and all the rest. We had a wonderful discussion. We talked about the Soviet Union and the Cold War and many other issues. And actually, here's something he said, which would be of interest to this audience. He said, Nacht, he said, if you do one thing useful in the time you're here, is make sure you have an expert deputy assistant secretary for cybersecurity. Because cybersecurity is a game changer. It's the most significant new development in military capability. And you're on the leading edge. You're doing the high-tech stuff. Nuclear weapons, of course, things can happen. We know a lot about them. Missile defense, we know a lot about them. Space, yes, is going through changes, but we know a lot about them. Cyber, we're first learning. So we did. We were able to recruit an excellent person, a former Air Force officer, who had lasted me by a year. He has now since left, too. And he did a great job leading a cyber team. So relations were fine, and my interaction with him was sporadic, but more than once or twice. He's smart. He's comes across as very seasoned. He's been through many, many wars. I don't mean necessarily international conflicts. I just mean bureaucratic wars. He had a reputation during the Cold War as a real hardline anti-Soviet person, which may or may not have been appropriate. I won't say the one way or the other. He's not like that now. He's not ideological. He's analytical. He looks at the data, and he offers his opinion and makes tough decisions. It's alleged now from the press that he actually opposed the president's decision to support the no-fly zone in Libya. He didn't want to do that because he thought the U.S. would get dragged into Libya. This would be a third Muslim country we were at war with. He didn't want to do it. He's very cautious. It's alleged, this was in the press, that he opposed the way the bin Laden raid was carried out because he was involved with Carter with a failed hostage rescue mission where helicopters smashed into each other in 1979. He thought this could happen again in 2011, and it did happen. Not that they smashed into each other, but you probably know that the first helicopter hit the wall, and evidently the first word somebody said in that Situation Room, you saw the photos that went all over the world of them sitting in the Situation Room, was somebody said, uh-oh, here we go again. Because the risk-taking of that operation was gigantic. I mean, in some ways, the president was betting his entire future, the administration's future, on the success of that operation. That meant they had to go in clandestinely. They had to find bin Laden, and Panetta only said there was a 70% chance he was there. Nobody knew for certain. They had to get him out or kill him. They had to get away without Americans being killed. They had to get away without the Pakistanis finding out. I mean, the number of things that could have gone wrong are, more than three. But it did work okay. And but this was another case where actually Gates was overruled. But he doesn't take this personally, this is my best view. The president is the boss. He decides, and that's it. On many other issues, the president very much supported what the secretary wanted. So I think actually, sort of the politics never came up. It just never was a factor in dealing with the political appointees in the Pentagon.
That helicopter that went down in the compound, in fact, was then a great debate because we tried, as best I understand, to do a destruction on it because it would be left behind. But even with it, shall we say, partially destroyed, the word is that the Chinese were very anxious for the Pakistanis to let them look at that, whatever rubble it was, to see if there were not certain aspects of built-in defense, et cetera, that they could use. And so that became another kind of question within our infamous relationships with the Pakistani government. I want to ask you something else about Gates. We were talking as we came into the room about the tremendous problems of the administration now, which are financial in major ways. And in that particular question, you hear a lot of rumbling around from the Tea Party all the way over to the more liberal side of the Democratic Party that the place to cut in order to make things work is the Defense Department. Now, I understand that Gates made it one of his major efforts was to, in fact, cut waste in the Defense Department. He closed bases. I know that for a fact in the state of Virginia, where I am from, because our senators wrote me and said, this is a terrible thing that's happening to us in Virginia. We're bearing this terrible burden by having our bases closed. So many in Congress are very interested in saving money from defense as long as it doesn't come from their state. And at the same time, Gates realized that there was handwriting on the wall and one should have a lean and mean organization. Now, just tell me in your own opinion, is it possible to balance the American budget totally on the Defense Department budget?
No. I mean, I think,
closer to.
When you work, and I don't know how many of you have worked physically in the Pentagon, it is a gigantic place. It's the Roman Empire. I mean, it's huge. It takes you weeks or months just to figure out where the men's room is. I don't know how many people. Someone said 25,000 people work there. Maybe many, many more than that. And the defense budget is gigantic as well. There are so many different elements of it. It is so complex. There are so many contractors involved that I think what they're doing is they're looking at higher priced items to see where they can make cuts that are meaningful because we have a $14 trillion deficit heading towards $17 trillion. We have a budget deficit that's well over $1 trillion heading up. Well, none of these weapon systems cost that much. So, of course, it's going to have to be some kind of mix. There will have to be defense cuts, and I think there's $500 million now already being implemented to be cut. There'll have to be other programs cut. And in my view, there have to be some increases in revenues through selective tax increases. But as you all know, there's political gridlock, and unless there's a change, This super committee will not come out with a formula, and if they don't, on November 23rd, it's next week, next no, 2 weeks. November 23rd, if the super committee doesn't come out with a plan that's all agreed upon to cut $1.2 trillion from the budget, then automatically another $500 billion will be cut from the defense budget, and $500 billion will be cut from other programs. Panetta has said the latter scenario would be unacceptable. And there is evidently some movement in Congress now to make an exception for the defense budget. So, I didn't work the defense budget. I only know snippets of it. I'm sure there's definitely waste in the defense budget. There are many programs that don't have to be funded. But the problem is, when you get into a situation like that, every single program, every expenditure has its defenders, has its constituency in Congress, in lobbyists, and it's tough to make these cuts. I do think there will be cuts. I just hope they don't really cut into what you might call the muscle of the U.S. military. I am concerned more broadly, and this is just my own personal view, that the economic problems are so deep and so pervasive. I tend to agree with Admiral Mullen, who stepped down as chairman of the Joint Chiefs on September 30th, 6 weeks ago? And in his final testimony in Congress, he was asked by a senator, what is the single biggest threat to the United States national security? This is a 40-year Navy veteran, 4 stars, and he said the single biggest threat is American economic weakness. He didn't say it was the Chinese. He doesn't say laser systems, cyber. Because the weakness will ultimately lead to cuts, and that will lead to retrenchment. We'll have to begin to pull back. We cannot afford $700 billion a year, which is what we're spending, plus $70 billion plus for the intelligence community every year, and that doesn't include the wars. And therefore, I'm not saying we're Britain in 1945, but American influence will begin to pull back. And some Americans would love that. A lot of people in San Francisco would love it. They say, we're the world's problem. We're not the world's solution. My view is a little different. I don't think we're the world's problem. We're not perfect. We've got 1,000 issues here. But like Churchill would say, eventually we come around to the right decision after trying all the wrong decisions. And I think whoever will replace us, whoever will fill the vacuum, we're not going to like the results. If China fills the vacuum, if Islamic fundamentalist groups fill the vacuum, this will not be a plus. So I'm very concerned about that.
You are serving in the Pentagon when the decision came down to surge in Afghanistan, a decision that was very much debated. I believe he's now at Hoover, and he will be with us next semester. Then in those days he was known as General Eikenberry, and now he is simply Dr. Eikenberry at the Hoover. And he will come and explain what he did on the ground in Afghanistan as a general, and then what he did when he became the ambassador in Kabul, and why he opposed the surge, and why his good friend then Petraeus was for the surge, and why, what we want to know tonight, what did you think of the surge, wrong or correct?
Well, I can only answer now as a sort of student of national security, not based on my experience, because I was not engaged in the decision-making about the surge. I told you my portfolio, nuclear weapons, missile defense, cyber, space, and countering proliferation. So Afghanistan was not something I worked on, except for certain cyber applications, which I can't discuss here. I understood why the president did what he did. He did it as much for political reasons as for strategic reasons. After all, he campaigned on the view that Iraq was the wrong war and Afghanistan was the right war. Afghanistan needed to be changed because that's where al-Qaeda built its capability. That's from where they attacked us on 9/11. If we didn't stabilize Afghanistan, not democratize, but stabilize it, and strengthen the government in Kabul so that they could deal with their own security, then the Taliban and al-Qaeda would come back and they'd launch more attacks on us. I didn't think that was a crazy idea. Where it's very, very difficult is when you actually see the details of Afghanistan. It is so, the terrain, the complexity of the tribal relationships, the animosities within Afghanistan, you know, they're as complex as the U.S. defense budget. It's just, it gives you a headache thinking about it. And we know, you know, the Taliban are Afghans, they live there. We're just renting. At some point, we'll leave. It might not be, you know, now we're going to leave in 2014. Maybe we're starting earlier to withdraw. Is it 2020, 2030? At some point, we won't be there. And unless the central government is able to convey its authority throughout the country at that time, we're going to have additional problems with them. So I thought, all things considered, the president did the right thing at that time. Now, the problem, I know Carl Eikenberry well, General Eikenberry. He was a colonel when I knew him. He was the military attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. When I visited the U.S. Embassy in Beijing in 1994 with Secretary of Defense Perry on really one of the first high-level trips by U.S. Officials since Tiananmen Square in '89. And I met him there, and I learned that he was a Stanford Harvard guy. He had studied with Ezra Vogel, who I also know very, very well. And he's a very smart guy. And I gather from what one reads, I haven't spoken with him about this, that he felt that the corruption, the endemic, actually, hostility of many of the Afghan leaders toward the United States was so pervasive that it was like throwing good money after bad. And he was particularly critical of Karzai, which ultimately, of course, didn't help him in his relations down the road. Petraeus, I think, on the other hand, felt, look, he had been able to turn things around in Iraq. He could turn things around in Afghanistan. And I think the jury is still out whether this is feasible or not. I have some friends who've been in Afghanistan. I have, my wife's cousin has served there twice. It's very tough. It's very tough. But on the other hand, you know, if the U.S. got out, and if 7 months later there was an attack on the United States as bad or worse than 9/11 that emanated from Afghanistan, the American people would want to string the president up. How could you withdraw from Afghanistan? So it's a tough problem.
Do you think that President Obama and a very feisty these days Secretary of State, Mrs. Clinton, have the kind of guts to say, well, the only thing that could really run Afghanistan is the Taliban, so we can come to an agreement where they come back into government, we will live with that?
Well, the only thing I know about that is, again, from largely press accounts, where clearly there were efforts, very low-key, even clandestine efforts, to reach out to the Taliban. And there were discussions. I guess they met with some Taliban leaders. And also Karzai has met with Taliban leaders. But I gather they've all come to naught. I think the Taliban might see that, in a way, it's a little bit like the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. I don't want to push the analogy too far, but it's basically, you know, we can outweight you. They see the economic problems in this country. They see, we don't have the country in flames over Afghanistan like we did over Vietnam, but clearly there's not a ton of support. And in fact, from just reading public opinion polls and other polls, the Congress is now has very mixed views about Afghanistan. In fact, there's an interesting alliance seemingly developing between liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans who want to get out. So, you know, and with the computer world, I mean, they can see what's going on from wherever they are in Afghanistan. So I think they just know if they just inflict punishment, sort of like Muhammad Ali, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, sting and get out, kill some Americans, get out. and just let that be broadcast back to America, eventually the U.S. will get out. So why should they negotiate? Why should they compromise? They think they can get the whole thing. And, they may be right.